History can be found anywhere, even in your own backyard. So join us as we search the land, looking for the stories that helped shape this nation. Come on the porch, grab a drink, and join us for a little bit of history from the homestead. Hey there, history buffs, and welcome to this episode of the History from the Homestead podcast. I am your host, Thomas Carroll, and today we are doing a bit of a special episode. Today is the anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks, and I reached out to a handful of friends to share their stories from what they remember of that day. I will start off first. I'll share my own personal story, but I figure we should probably take a moment of silence to honor those that we lost back in 2001. So, for those of you that are old enough to remember the events of September 11th, I guarantee you all of you remember where you were, what you were doing on that fateful day. For those of you who maybe are listening that don't remember, I'm sure you have been seeing the news today, so we're not going to dive into the details and the history of it. But I will share my story first. I was still in high school when that happened. I was actually in my English class that was taught by Miss Kozic. And our class was right next door to the library. And our librarian, Miss Bissett, had come through the door and picked up, there was a phone on the wall. This was, in the days before smartphones. There was, cell phones were flip phones and you still had corded phones and stuff. And she picked up the phone on the wall and was talking to somebody, I don't know who. And she ran over, she turned the TV on, and it was, as we all saw there, the breaking news story, the fire, the smoke coming out of the North Tower. And this was just before the second plane had hit. And we were all sitting there watching the news when the second plane, live on TV, came and hit the second tower. And I just remember, I don't remember thinking that we were under attack. I don't remember thinking that. I remember just sitting in absolute stunned silence at what I had just seen. I almost couldn't believe it. And we spent the rest of the day just watching news stories. Then the Pentagon was hit, and then rumors started going around that a fourth plane had went down, and it was unconfirmed. Which where I went to school at was in Boswell, Pennsylvania, which is just a couple miles down the road from Shanksville. There had been rumors that it had crashed in Somerset, rumors it crashed in Jennerstown. At the time when I was a kid, I was living in Jennerstown. I didn't know if it had crashed on my house. I had no idea. And then I remember it came in and it was confirmed that it had went down in Shanksville in it was an old abandoned strip cut, but had been reclaimed. It was just an empty field. And I remember my mom had came, like many other students, picked me up early from school and sent us home. And then it was just watching the news, trying to make sense of what happened. But later on that night, probably the biggest thing I can remember is open. It was a nice fall evening, having the window open and looking up and not seeing the ever-present airplanes flying, not hearing the noise, seeing the lights, just seeing. And it was just an eerie, really eerie calm that night. It was really weird. I don't even totally know how to describe it, but I just remember it was just such a quiet night. There was nobody out, no planes flying. Everybody was home, glued to their TVs, or mourning those that we lost in New York and in Washington D.C. and here near me in Pennsylvania. So I thought that it might be interesting to do an episode where I check, get stories from, my other friends that I, known over the years to what their thoughts for today. So the next bunch of audio that you're going to hear was I just had my friends sit down, record themselves telling what they wanted, how they wanted, what they felt they needed to tell. So you'll hear a range of anything from a couple minutes to over 10 minutes long of what everybody did that day. And it'll start off with a good friend of mine, uh, Lon Strickler. I'll start off with his, and I will just introduce everybody as we go. So,
Hey, it's Lon Strickler. My 9/11 experience. Well, I guess this is about 8:30 or whenever the first plane hit the North Tower. I was on my computer working, and my wife was at work, and she had given me a call, and she said to me, she said, "What's going on in New York?" I said, "I don't know. I'm not watching TV." So I turned the TV on, and I saw that, something had hit the tower. It was on fire. So I was watching it, and I was on the phone with her when the other plane hit the South Tower. At that point, I told her, I think we were having a terrorist attack. So she left work. She was freaked out and grabbed a cab and came home. By that time, my son's school called me. He was in grade school at the time, and told me to come pick him up because they were letting everybody out. So, anyway, as the day went by, of course, we're all watching TV like, everybody else. And then we found out what happened in Shanksville. And, of course, before that, at the Pentagon. Now, I had a friend who died at the Pentagon who was actually in the Navy, and he died in the attack. Yeah, that was my experience on 9/11, and I hope we never have to go through anything like that again because it was intensive. So take care.
the next person we will hear from is Jessica Dobner-Velpo.
September 11th, 2001. I was asleep in my bed. My husband came home because he was working third shift and said that an airplane had hit the World Trade Center. And I said, on purpose? And he said, we don't know yet. So got up and went into the living room, turned on the TV, and the second one hit. And we knew then that it was definitely on purpose. So we watched the news, trying to figure out what was going on. No one, of course, knew. Then the Pentagon got hit, and it was clear that it was an attack. I went to work later that day, and we just listened to the radio, all the news that was coming out. Still no one knew anything. It was just mostly people sharing their experiences. And every customer that came in had, wanted to talk about it. They shared how they were feeling and what was going on around town. And just everybody was scared. No one was joking around like usual. It was just kind of scary.
And up next is our account from Mary Golden Rebar.
So this is my September 11th story. I was a traveling sales associate, and I sold office filing equipment, and I was on my way to Garrett County, Maryland to drop off an order of filing supplies for the health department. And it's a decent drive from here in Somerset County. At the time, we lived right off of 30 down behind the Queen Mahoning Dam. My daughter was in high school. My son was in grade school. They were both at school. I was traveling to Garrett County to, go about my work day. I was talking to a friend on my cell phone. And as I was talking to her, she said that she just saw on the news a giant airplane hit one of the World Trade Towers. And I remember commenting that, the towers are pretty big, but the sky is bigger. How did a plane hit one of the towers? And it was weird because I got the strangest shiver up my spine, like the little hairs in the back of my neck stood up. I should have turned around and went home right then. Should have listened to that intuition. And now, if I ever have something like that, I heed its warning. But I continued on my drive, and as I was talking to her, she went, "Oh my gosh, Mare, a second plane just hit the other tower." And as I'm talking to her, and we're discussing, like, something strange is happening, and, at that point I knew something weird was going down. But I still wasn't very alarmed because it was in New York City. I'm in rural Somerset County. I'm heading my way south into rural Garrett County. So it was pretty far removed from my life. Kept going, listening to the news. I'm talking to her on the phone. All of a sudden, the cell phones go dead. I didn't know what was happening. Back in that day, it was not uncommon, especially traveling through rural areas, for your cell phone to die or lose signal or what have you. But there was no signal at all. It was almost like my phone had been shut off. I thought, okay, that's kind of weird. So I'm listening to the radio, and I'm hearing reports then of a plane hitting the Pentagon. And I'm getting closer to Garrett County. And I'm thinking, wow, this is just really weird. I'm going to make this delivery and I'm going to go home because this is just not setting easy with me. Those little hairs on the back of my neck were still prickling and warning me. So when I pulled into the Garrett County Health Department, and at this point on the radio, that's all you could hear about, and that's all they were talking about, and the speculation that we were under attack and so forth. I walk into the county health department, and everyone's standing around the television or standing around a radio, and they're listening, and they all look very traumatized. And a girl comes running from the other room saying she was talking to her husband, and I guess they were on a landline phone at that point. And he had told her that he was a part of an EMT or what have you, and he was listening to a scanner. And he heard that they landed a terrorist hijacked 747 at the Somerset County Airport. And there's also a Somerset County in Maryland. So my first reaction was, you mean Somerset County, Maryland, right? Because I am from Somerset. I know the size of the Somerset County Airport, and there is no way a 747 is landing at that airport. So I'm just assuming that it's landing someplace else. And she said, no, the Somerset County, Pennsylvania airport, they try to land a terrorist hijacked 747. And then she says, oh, wait, he's saying that it missed the runway and it crash landed. At that point, my stomach dropped because a straight shot in whatever direction you may be trying to land a plane from that airport, it is not far to the elementary school that my son was attending at that time and the high school that my daughter was attending at that time. I dropped that box, turned around, got in my car, and started speeding home. I needed gas. I was petrified. I didn't know what happened. I couldn't make a phone call to anybody. All I could hear what was happening on the news. And they had shut the power off in Garrett County, Maryland. So the street lights weren't functioning. I couldn't get gas there because the power was shut off. And panic was setting in. I couldn't talk to anybody. I couldn't reach anybody. All I kept hearing was the speculation that we were under fire from a foreign invader. And you know how the news likes to sensationalize things. This was a terrible thing that was happening in hindsight. But at that point in time, like, we did not know what was happening. I did not know if my children were alive. I did not know where that airplane landed. I am probably driving anywhere between 80 and 90 miles an hour on back roads the whole ways home from Garrett County. I made it to a gas station in Accident, Maryland, and I stopped, and they had the old-timey pumps that didn't involve having to have electricity or what have you. I was able to get a little bit of gas, and I saw that they had a payphone. So I made a collect call. The payphone still had a dial tone. I made a collect call back to the office that I worked out of in Johnstown. And when my office manager answered, I was in a complete state of panic at that point. And I guess they were worried about where I was because they knew I had headed that direction. And she said she was glad to hear from me. And I just started wanting to know adamantly where that plane was. And she said it crash landed. They think it's in a field off of Route 30. Still not really confident at this point that it didn't land, that there weren't terrorists running around Somerset County. And now when I think about that, I start laughing because, you know, I don't think they'd have much of a chance with the, you know, residents that live here if that were true. But I didn't know. Like, I didn't know what was happening. She said they felt strongly that it was in a field, but they weren't sure where, but it was just off of 30. So my kids' schools have fields around them. I did not know what was going on. I was afraid of not being able to get home because she told me they closed all the roads around where they thought the plane went down, and Route 30 was one of them. And as I was coming off of 219 onto 30, the black SUVs, the rescue squads, the fire trucks, the everything just flying down the road did not ease my sense of panic whatsoever. Got to the high school first and got my daughter. And she came running out. They were listening to it, I guess, on in the classroom. So she knew what was going down, and her and I just hugged on each other, started crying because I was one of the last parents to get there because I was so far away. So we went to get her brother at the elementary school, and you could see the panic in his little face. Like, he did not know what was happening. He just knew something was happening. Again, I was one of the last parents to get to the school, and the majority of the parents had already picked up their children. He was left there. He did not know what was happening. And the first words out of his mouth were, "What in the world is going on, Mom?" And I said, "It's okay. Like, come on, let's just go home." I grabbed him up and we were hugging him, and we went to the house and turned on the television. And I was explaining to him that planes had been wrecked into buildings. You know, he's young. He's in, it was 4th, 5th grade, something like that. Video games were a really big thing then. Things crashing into stuff was a really big, you know, thing in his life. And he said, "Oh, cool." And I'm like, "No, not cool." I'm like, people have been killed. And when we turned on the television and they showed the first plane hitting the trade tower, and then they were showing subsequent footage of people falling from the sky, his little face, like his knees buckled, and he just dropped and sat on the couch. That's when I think it really impacted him. And this was all that was on television for days. My daughter was old enough to understand, you know, what was going on. But this really rocked all our worlds. Because the days following, when flights were grounded, and he knew and they knew that flights weren't supposed to be flying, they were flying to the you know, the crash site. So there were low flying planes going over top of the house. And I would get phone calls from him because he was home from school and I still had to go to work. And he'd be like, "Mom, an airplane just flew really low over the house and it was really big." So I can't imagine the fear and what his imagination was doing to him at that time in history. And I would make jokes. I'm like, "Well, that was the president. He's going up to the visit. So when you see the plane fly back over, you just wave." Making jokes of it to make light of it because he was really worked up by it. But I will tell you that it was the strangest thing having my cell phone shut off, seeing all the power shut down in Garrett County, Maryland, which I thought was bizarre. But I don't know how true it is. But some sources were saying that there is an underground bunker somewhere in Garrett County, Maryland that they brought the vice president to. And I don't know what shutting the power off would do, but that's the reason I was told that the power in the county was shut down. You know, so not to show up on whatever devices that things they use, whatever. It just sounded just so surreal to me. But that day was one of the scariest days of my life, because until I knew where that plane was down at, I did not know if it landed on our home, if it landed on, you know, the schools, if my children were safe. I didn't know what to expect. Plus, having the sensationalism of the news, making something that was horrific and tragic, making it more of an unknown, like making it more frightening with the speculation of what it could possibly be, was horrible. To this day, I don't really care to listen to the news, because that was just an awful period in time, not knowing if loved ones were safe. It was something that I won't forget. I'm sure my kids won't forget it, as anybody in this country that lived through that will not forget it. But that is my 911 story. I don't ever want to have to go through something like that again. But thanks for listening.
Our next account is from Chris Taylor.
9/11/2001. I worked at an auto repair shop. I was listening to the Kevin and Bean show on the world famous K-Rock, Southern California, in the morning. And Kevin and Bean weren't on yet, and I couldn't figure out why. And Ralph Garman and Doc on the Rock were talking about what happened, and I just kind of blew it off. I didn't really think it was anything. That show's kind of a joke at the time, but I left and I got to work, and I always turn on TV immediately in the waiting room for the customers. I was a service manager, and saw a second plane hit. That just dropped the heart out of me, man. I don't know what to say. It was pretty wild. Physically seeing it on TV hit at the time that it hit, just, I don't know, man. It really screws with your head. Like, who would do that? Kind of a weird, I don't know. It felt like we were totally violated, which I guess we were, technically. The rest of the day, we didn't have any customers at all. And nobody went to work that day. We went to work, we came to work, and we didn't do anything all day. It was an interesting situation. It was nothing like any of us had ever seen in our lives before. I was about 31 at the time, and I mean, nothing like that. I mean, people had tried to blow up the World Trade Center before, but they never succeeded, because you can't do that. They needed the planes to do it, and they did it. They got away with it, and they really effed up this country, man. And I don't know, it's a variable about what I think about this country. I don't know, you know? What America did after that, I don't think we should have, but we did. There's never been never been back. This country's never been back that way. That's about all I have to say about it. Well, tomorrow's 9/11, so let's just hope nothing like that ever happens again in this country.
And our final account is from Bernadette McDaniel.
I was 17 when 9/11 happened, and it was horrible. I mean, I was getting ready for school that morning. It was late. I forget why I was late, and my mom was taking me to school. So I was downstairs putting my shoes on, and she had Fox and Friends on. My mom watched Fox and Friends, and like they had just had a close up of the first tower that had been hit, and I couldn't tell what it was. Like I didn't really watch news. I didn't care, to be honest. I'm like, what is this weird thing that's on TV? And they were very quiet. That like nobody was saying what it was. There's no real like thing that was going on. And then the second plane came around, and I do remember seeing it and like thinking it's weird because it was so big, and it just hit into the tower, and for some reason my gut dropped. And the announcers on the show kind of were like, you know, this was not an accident. We're realizing it's not an accident. This was all done on purpose, both planes. And I'm like, both planes? And the camera finally panned out and showed it was the Twin Towers, and that both of them had been hit, and it was awful. My mom came in and she saw it, and she was just like, what's going on? And I told her, and she was watching it for a few minutes, and she said, no, you're not going to school. You're staying home. You're not going to school. And I said, okay. So all throughout the day, when towers collapsed and everything, we were like, I think like everyone else, we were glued to the coverage. And it was devastating. Like you don't think that something like that could have happened here. At least I never thought of it. I was, like I said, I was a stupid teenager, but it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking to hear the stories. It was terrible. I mean, the one that stood out to me was this lady had called her mom, and like told her she was stuck in the stairwell. She was trying to get down. She was halfway down, I think, but it was getting bad. She could hear cracking and stuff, and her mom was like, just keep going and everything. And the building actually collapsed with the woman on the phone, and the mother heard screaming, and she was there at the tower site like while they were searching for survivors and everything, and it was heartbreaking. Like what do you do? You know, as a country, we've been through so much. Now we're kind of immune to it, but back then we were all very lost that day. And for those old enough to remember it, it still kind of, you know, has that little pang, I guess you could call it. It just, you know, it takes you back every year, at least. For me, it does. And I still worry. I mean, I don't think anyone that day or in the days following, when they heard a plane, they didn't like stop and look up, and it changed. It changed us, I think. It changed everybody, especially if you were a teenager then and you're an adult now. It's changed you. So, but I still, my heart still breaks for the families and for everyone, you know, who had to suffer, their children, their, you know, their wives, their husbands. So, and I hope it never happens again. And this many years have passed, and it's still fresh. Like, I can still remember my white sneakers, and I can still remember the TV being in front of me, and yeah. So, that's how much it's been embedded in our memory.
I thank everybody again for tuning into this special episode. I'd like to thank my friends Lon Strickler, Jessica Dodner-Velpel, Chris Taylor, Bernadette McDaniel, and Mary Golden Rebar for joining me and sharing their stories with me. So I thank you all very much for sharing your stories. I thank you all for listening. And remember, as you go through today, take a moment and remember those innocent people that we lost back in 2001. And never forget that. Never forget what a tragic day that was. So thank you all for tuning in. Thanks to everybody for listening. Remember, if you like the show, you can share it with all your friends. We can be found on all the major podcast players. We can be found on Facebook. And you can also find us and catch the show notes at historyfromthehomestead.com.